Hello everybody, for this module we are continuing with Perry's dialogue. We will be moving on from Perry's second night. If it has been a while since you viewed the last lecture, you may wish to review your notes because we will be picking up right from where we left off without a great deal of review. If you recall, during the first night, Sam Miller was trying to convince Gretchen Weerrob that she could survive death, and he was attempting to do so by defending the sole criterion of personal identity. They had a particular deal. Sam doesn't need to show that life after death is likely, or even that it fits in with our current understanding of science for Weerrob to be comforted. He merely needs to show that it is possible. Part of this possibility means that there are no contradictions, that the kind of survival is meaningful, in other words, that Weerrob can look forward to the experiences of the person who survives, that Miller has a conception of what it means when he says she will survive, that he acknowledges her present physical condition, that's to say that she will die and her body will rot away. Now, if you recall, previously Sam Miller defended the sole criterion of personal identity. Under this conception of personal identity, a person is the same person if and only if they have the same soul. Miller gives up on the sole criterion approach when he begins the second night. Weerrob starts the discussion by asking, "Well, Sam, have you figured out a way to make sense of the identity of immaterial souls?" Miller responds, "No, I have decided that it was a mistake to build my argument on such a dubious notion. But this does not mean that he has given up on the idea that she can survive death, or that he has abandoned a religious point of view. He is simply giving up on the idea that souls, if they exist, are sufficient to explain personal identity." So, when Weerrob asks, "Have you then given up on survival?" I think that such a position would be a hard one for a clergyman to live with and would feel bad about having pushed you so far. Miller says, "Don't worry, I am more convinced than ever. I stayed up late last night thinking and reading, and I'm sure I can convince you now." The point of view that Miller is going to put forward today is the memory criterion of personal identity. That is the position held by John Locke. A person is the same person if and only if that person has the same memories or connected conscious experiences. These memories may or may not be lodged in a soul. The material that they are made up of isn't what is important. What is important is the content. So, Miller need not give up on the idea that souls exist in order to argue for this criterion. They are just not essential to personal identity. Miller says, "First let me explain why, independently of my desire to defend survival after death, I am dissatisfied with your view that personal identity is just bodily identity. My argument will be very similar to the one you used to convince me that personal identity could not be identified with the identity of an immaterial soul. Consider a person waking up tomorrow morning, conscious but not yet ready to open her eyes and look around and, so to speak, start the day. Now, couldn't such a person tell who she was? That is, even before opening her eyes and looking around, and in particular before looking at her body or making any judgments about it, wouldn't she be able to say who she was? Surely most of us in the morning know who we are before opening our eyes and reckoning our own bodies, do we not?" Weerrob agrees that she could do just that. Miller continues, "But such a judgment as the person makes, we shall suppose she judges, 'I am Gretchen Weerrob,' is a judgment of personal identity. Suppose she says to herself, 'I am the very person who was arguing with Sam Miller last night.' This is clearly a statement about her identity with someone who was alive the night before. And she can make this judgment without examining her body at all. You could have made just this judgment this morning, before opening your eyes." Weerrob responds, "Well, in fact I did so. I remembered our conversation of last night and said to myself, could I be the rude person who was so hard on Sam Miller's attempts to comfort me? And of course my answer was that I not only could be, but was that very rude person." Miller then highlights his point. "But then by the same principle you used last night, personal identity cannot be bodily identity. For you said that it could not be identity of the immaterial soul, because we were not judging as to identity of immaterial souls when we were judging as to personal identity. But by the same token, as my example shows, we are not judging as to bodily identity when we judge to personal identity either. For we can judge who we are, and that we are the very person who did such and such with so and so, without having to make any judgments at all about personal identity. So personal identity, while it may not consist of identity of an immaterial soul, does not consist in identity of a material body either." So this is a reference back to Weerrob's arguments before. Since one cannot sense a soul in any way, she argued that Miller cannot be judging souls when he judges personal identity. That is to say, when he judges her to be the same person he, for example, had lunch with. He cannot sense them, so he cannot connect a soul to a body. Miller is now trying to use this same argument against her. If Wirab can know who she is without sensing her body, then she must not be judging her own personal identity through her body. She must be judging that she is the same person based on something else. Wirab's first attempted response is to say, but I also said that the notion of the identity of an immaterial, unobservable, unextended soul seems to make no sense at all. This is one reason that cannot be what we are judging about when we are judging as to personal identity. Bodily identity at least makes sense. Perhaps we are assuming sameness of body without looking. But Miller presses the point. Granted, but you do admit that we do not, in our own case, actually need to make a judgment about bodily identity in order to make a judgment of personal identity. Wirab doesn't quite admit this, but she says that they can currently work with that and proceed with the argument for the time being. Miller then alters his thought experiment, asking her to imagine that she wakes up in an entirely different body. He says, okay, now it seems to me that we are able to even imagine waking up and finding ourselves to have a different body than the one we had before. Suppose yourself, just as I have described to you. And now suppose you finally open your eyes and see not the body you have grown so familiar with over the years, but one fundamentally different in size and shape. Wirab doesn't see the full force of this point at first. She says, well, I should suppose I had been asleep for a very long time and lost a lot of weight. Perhaps I was in a coma for a year or so. But Miller is suggesting a more drastic change. He says, but isn't it at least conceivable that it should not be your old body at all? I seem to be able to imagine awakening with a totally new body. Wirab wonders how this could possibly happen, but Miller correctly points out that is besides the point. I am not saying I can imagine a procedure that would bring this about. I am saying I can imagine it happening to me. In Kafka's Metamorphosis, someone awakens as a cockroach. I can't imagine what would make this happen to me or anyone else, but I can imagine awakening with the body of a cockroach. It is incredible that it should happen, that I do not deny. I simply mean I can imagine experiencing it. It does not seem contradictory or incoherent, simply unlikely and inexplicable. So he is right about this. He is presenting a thought experiment, and the point isn't how something like this might happen, but rather to test our conceptions with the variables that the thought experiment allows us to change to see if they would hold. Wirab responds, so if I admit that this can be imagined, what follows then? Miller replies, well, I think that it follows that personal identity does not just amount to bodily identity, for I would not, finding that I had a new body, conclude that I was not the very same person. I would be the same person though I did not have the same body. So we would have identity of persons but not identity of bodies. So personal identity cannot just amount to bodily identity. Wirab asks where this leaves him and presses, what do you claim I have recognized as the same if not my body and not my immaterial soul? Miller then goes back to the Blue River example. He says, let me appeal to you as you did to the Blue River. Suppose I take a visitor to the stretch of river by the old mill and then drive him toward Manhattan. After an hour or so drive, we see another stretch of river, and I say, that is the same river we saw this morning. As you pointed out yesterday, I don't thereby imply that the very same molecules of water are seen both times. And the places are different, perhaps 100 miles apart, and the shape and color and level of pollution might all be different. What do I see later in the day that is identical with what I saw earlier in the day? Wirab says, nothing except the river itself. Miller then says, exactly. But now notice that what I see, strictly speaking, is not the whole river, but only part of it. I see different parts of the same river at two different times. So really, if we restrict ourselves to what I literally see, I do not judge identity at all, but something else. So Wirab asks what this could be, and he says, in saying that the river I seen earlier and the river I seen later are one and the same river, I do not mean any more than that the stretch of water seen later and the stretch of water seen earlier are connected by other stretches of water. And Wirab says, that's about right. So what is Miller saying here? Imagine a river stretching for miles. We want to say that multiple sections of this river are the same river. Likewise, we want to say that it is the same river that flowed through the same area since colonial times, and if we came back in 100 years, we would still want to say it was the same river. but notice that the river isn't the same for multiple parts of the river. Even if that same river segment is visited, the water changes swiftly over time. Likewise, even the quality of the water might change. It might be polluted today, but 100 years ago it might have been pristine. Differences in rainfall or times of year might mean that it is sluggish some years and flows swiftly during others, and so forth. So what makes the river the same? Miller is saying that it is the connectedness and relationship of the parts that make the river segments part of the same river. All of these parts of the river are the same river because they are connected in a continuous way throughout space and time. Can you see the point that Miller is trying to make about personhood with this? Pause the video and think about it for a moment. What do you think about his point about persons? So Weirwob asks, is this all something special about rivers? And Miller says, not at all. It is a recurring pattern. After all, we constantly deal with objects extended in space and time, but we are seldom aware of the object's wholes, but only of their parts or stretches of their histories. When a statement of identity is not something trivial, like this bed is this bed, it is usually because we are really judging that different parts fit together in some appropriate pattern into a certain kind of whole. Miller gives another example. He says, suppose we are sitting together watching the first game of a doubleheader. You ask me, is this game identical with this game? That's a perfectly stupid question, though of course strictly speaking it makes sense and the answer is yes. Now suppose you leave in the 6th inning and go for hot dogs. You are delayed and return about 45 minutes or so. You ask, is this the same game I was watching? Now your question is not stupid, but perfectly appropriate. Weirwob clarifies, because the first game might still be going on, or it might have ended and the second game begun by the time I return. So, for those of you who might be as inept with sports as I am, a doubleheader is when two teams play against each other twice. What Miller is saying is that if Weirwob left for the concession stand in the middle of the game and was gone for a long time, when she came back, her question if this is the same game makes perfect sense. The first game might have finished, but the very same players might be back on the field playing the second part of the doubleheader. So the players could be in the same game, or they could be in a different one. Note, even the score could be the same, but the game could be different. Weirwob crystallizes his point. So you think that judgments as to the identity of an object of a certain kind, rivers or baseball games or whatever, involve judgments as to the parts of those things being connected in a certain way, and are significant only when different parts are involved. And Miller confirms, yes, and I think that it is an important one. How foolish it would be when we ask a question about the identity of baseball games to look for something else other than the games as a whole, which had to be the same. It could be the same game, even if different players were involved. It could be the same game, even if it had moved to a different field. These other things, the innings, the plays, the players, the fields, don't have to be the same at different times for the game to be the same. They just have to be related in certain ways so as to make the complex whole we call a single game. So I will explain this to you in a little more detail. I will alter Miller's example slightly. Imagine, for example, that you were playing a chess game by email with somebody. You have a physical chessboard set up in your living room so that you can visualize the moves. Each day you email your friend one move. One day there is a fire in your house and the physical chessboard burns down. After moving to a new house, you go through all your old emails and set up the same moves on a new chessboard. Given this setup, it seems perfectly sensible to say that you were playing the same game even though the original chessboard was destroyed. It is the same game not because of the physical pieces used. The original is burned. It is not the same game even because of the position of the pieces. Two other players could have gotten to that same exact board arrangement through an entirely different series of moves. No, it is the same game because all of the moves are connected in a particular way through time. Move, response, move, response. That is what makes it the same game. The same is true with the baseball players on the field and the score of the doubleheader. So Miller then says that his pursuit of the soul was a kind of wild goose chase when talking about personal identity. Weirwob says, with rivers and baseball games, I can see that they are made up of parts connected in a certain way. The connection is, of course, different in the two cases, as is the sort of part involved. River parts must be connected physically with other river parts to form a continuous whole. Baseball, innings must be connected so that the score, batting order, and the like are carried over from the earlier inning to the later one according to the rules. Is there something analogous we are to say about persons? Miller then says, writers who concern themselves with this speak of person stages. That is just a stretch of consciousness, such as you and I are aware of now. I am aware of a flow of thoughts and feelings that are mine. You are aware of yours. A person is just a whole composed of such stretches as parts, not some substance that underlines them, as I thought yesterday, and not some body in which they occur as you seem to think. That is the conception of a person I wish to defend today. So Miller does not have to say that there's no underlying substance like a soul, but his point is that this isn't what makes up personal identity. Personal identity, he is now saying, is the person as a whole throughout time. It is the connection of one stage of consciousness to the other. You are the same person you are today as you were yesterday because the stages of your consciousness are connected in a particular way. Wirab clarifies, saying, so when I awoke and said to myself, I am the one who was so rude to Sam Miller last night, I was judging that a certain stretch of consciousness I was then aware of, and an earlier one I remembered having been aware of, form a single whole of an appropriate sort. A single stream of consciousness, we might say. And Miller says, yes, that is it exactly. The immaterial soul might be the same, if there is one, or it might not be. The body might be the same, if there is one, or it might not be. What is important now, according to Miller, is not, so to speak, something under the person's stages, nor something they are attached to, but something you build from them. So if this is true, Miller says that survival is perfectly possible. All you need to suppose is that there is in heaven a conscious being, and that the person stages that make her up are of the appropriate relation to those that now make you up, so that the parts form the same whole, namely you. If so, you have survived. So you will admit now that survival is at least possible. So, to survive, Miller is saying that the future her in heaven would just have to exist with a consciousness that was appropriately related to her current consciousness. This would mean having the same memories and so forth. Wirab says, hold on, comforting me is not that easy. You will have to show that it is possible that these person stages or stretches of consciousness be related in the appropriate way. And to do that, won't you have to tell me what that way is? Miller replies, yes, of course, I was getting ahead of myself. It is right at this point that my reading was particularly helpful. In a chapter on his essay on human understanding, Locke discusses this very question. He suggests the relationship between two person stages or stretches of consciousness that make them stages of a single person is just that the later one contains memories of the earlier one. He doesn't say this in so many words. He talks about extending our consciousnesses back in time, but he seems to be thinking of memory. So here we have the memory criterion of identity. As I mentioned before, Miller is using Locke's concept, and that is important to remember. A is the same person as B, if and only if A has the same memories as B. So Wirab asks if any past thought or feeling or intention or desire that I can remember having is mine. And Miller says that's right. I can remember only my own thoughts and feelings. Now you can easily see that this solves the problem of the possibility of survival. As I was saying, all you need to do is imagine somebody at some future time, not on this earth and not with your present thoughts and feelings, remembering the very conversation we are having now. So what Miller is saying is that nothing other than memory needs to be the same. The body can be destroyed. The soul can be the same, different, or non-existent. Miller is saying that Wirab survives if she has the same memories as she did before. So, now Miller has elucidated the memory criterion of personal identity. Can you see or anticipate any potential problems or objections against this view? Pause and consider this for a while before moving on. You can always hit pause on the video to give yourself time to think. So Wirab admits part of what he says, but points out that there could be a problem. She says, I admit that if I remember having a certain thought or feeling had by some person in the past, then I must indeed be that person. This is the kernel of Locke's idea, and I don't see that I could deny it. But we must distinguish, as I am sure you will agree, between actually remembering and merely seeming to remember. Many men who think that they are Napoleon claim to remember losing the Battle of Waterloo. We may suppose them to be sincere and to really seem to remember it, but they do not actually remember because they were not at the Battle of Waterloo and are not Napoleon. So what Wirab is pointing out here is that a person can think or seem to remember something that never really happened to her. Some people are so far gone that they remember the lives of famous historical figures, but it does not mean that they are those historical figures. Miller agrees with this, saying, of course, I admit that we must distinguish between actually remembering and only seeming to. Remember also Weirob's condition for what survival means. It must be, according to her, a real survival, a future with experiences she can look forward to. So she says, and you will admit too, I trust, that the thought of some person at some far place in some distant time seeming to remember this conversation I am having with you would not give me the sort of comfort that the prospect of survival is supposed to provide. I would have no reason to anticipate future experiences of this person simply because she seems to remember my experiences. The experiences of such a deluded impostor are not ones I can look forward to having. And Miller says that he agrees. Now maybe you can see the problem beginning to form. The mere fact that it is possible that somebody in the future seems to remember having the exact same conversation Weirwob is having with Miller now, even if this person also seems to remember all of her other past thoughts, does not show that it is possible for her to survive. To survive, the person would have to actually remember their current conversation, her past, and so forth. Though Miller agrees with this condition, he does not see the problem at first. He says, "But what are you driving at? Where is the problem? I can imagine someone being deluded, but also somebody actually being you and remembering your present thoughts." And here's where things get hairy. Weirwob then asks, "But what is the difference? How do you know which of the two you are imagining, and what have you shown as possible?" So she is asking him how he could possibly make this judgment about personal identity. He meets a future her in heaven that seems to have all of her memories, but how does he know that this person is really remembering, or only seeming to remember identical memories? This is true even for himself. He dies and appears in heaven. How does he know that he survived and really remembers his past, as opposed to being an entirely new person who only seems to remember his past? Everything has changed after all. His original body was destroyed. Miller doesn't see a problem at first. He says, "I just imagine one and not the other." But Weirwob thinks that the problem is more difficult than this. Weirwob says, "Let me try to make it clear to you with another example. Imagine two persons. One is talking to you, saying certain words, having certain thoughts, and so forth. The other is not talking to you at all, but is in the next room being hypnotized. The hypnotist gives to this person a post-hypnotic suggestion that upon awakening he will remember having had certain thoughts and having uttered certain words to you. The thoughts and words he mentions happens to be just the thoughts and words which the first person actually thinks and says. Do you understand the situation?" Miller says that he does, so she continues. Now, in a while, both of the people are saying sentences which begin, "I remember saying to Sam Miller," and "I remember thinking as I talked to Sam Miller," and they both report remembering just the same thoughts and utterances. One of these will be remembering, and the other only seeming to remember, right? Miller says, "Of course." Weirwob: "Now which one is actually remembering?" And Miller says, "Well, the very one who is in the room talking to me, of course. The other one is just under the influence of a suggestion made by the hypnotist and not remembering talking to me at all." Weirwob continues, "Now you agree that the difference between them does not consist in the content of what they are now thinking or saying." Miller then agrees, saying, "Agreed. The difference is the relation to the past thinking and speaking. In the one case the relation of memory obtains, in the other it does not." It is worth pausing here and clarifying Weirwob's point. When she says the difference does not consist in the content of what they are now thinking or saying, she is pointing out that this person's memory content can be absolutely perfect replicas of the real Weirwob's, and Miller agrees that this is not sufficient for identity. This is important to understand. A hypnotist probably couldn't actually convey such memories perfectly because he doesn't know what Weirwob is thinking when participating in the conversation. We are to imagine, however, that the hypnotized victim has memories with the same content. Imagine, for example, that the hypnotist has a device that scans Weirwob's brain in the other room and copies over all the memories and thoughts, overriding this person's own. Miller is agreeing that only the Weirwob who is engaged in that conversation has the thoughts and memories connected in the appropriate way. The other is not really her. Weirwob continues, "But they both satisfy part of the conditions of remembering, for they both seem to remember. So there must be some further condition that the one satisfies that the other does not. I'm trying to get you to say what that further condition is." Miller says, "Well, I said the one who had been in the room talking would be remembering." Weirwob: "In other words, given to putative rememberers of some past thought or action, the real rememberer is the one who, in addition to seeming to remember the past thought or action, actually thought or did it." Miller says, "Yes." Weirwob continues, "That is to say, the one who is identical with the person who did the past thinking and uttering." Miller says, "Yes, I admit it." Are you seeing the problem? Weirwob puts it this way. So your argument just amounts to this. Survival is possible because it is imaginable. It is imaginable because my identity with some heavenly person is imaginable. To imagine it, we imagine a person in heaven who, first, seems to remember my thoughts and actions, and second, is me. Surely there could hardly be a tighter circle. Think about this for a minute. Miller's position might at first seem to make sense, but he is admitting that merely having the same memories is not enough. There must be some further condition for identity. But his second condition seems to just be that it is really her remembering. That can't have any force. That's just saying that if it is really her, it is really her. She wants to know what it is he is saying that is surviving that would allow her to exist after death. Simply saying that if it is really her who survives death, then it is really her who survives death is not even a little bit helpful. Weirab says, if I have doubts that the heavenly person is me, I will have doubts as to whether she is really remembering or only seeming to. No one could possibly doubt the possibility of some future person who, after death, seemed to remember the things he thought and did. But that possibility does not resolve the issue about the possibility of survival. Only the possibility of someone actually remembering could do that. For that, as we agree, is sufficient for identity. Now Cohen finally speaks. Remember I said that there were 3 characters in the room. Cohen, Gretchen's former student, had mostly been listening until now, but now he jumps in because he thinks that he can strengthen Sam Miller's argument. He says, but wait, Gretchen, I think that Sam was less than fair to his own idea just now. Weirab asks if he thinks that he can break out of the cycle of using real memory to explain identity and identity to mark the difference between real and apparent memory. And Cohen continues, let us return to your case of the hypnotist. You point out that we have 2 putative rememberers. You ask what marks the difference and claim that the answer must be a circular one, that the real rememberer is the person who actually had the experiences both seem to remember. But that is not the only possible answer. The experiences themselves cause the later apparent memories in one case, while the hypnotist causes them in the other. We can say that the rememberer is the one of the 2 whose memories were caused in the right way by the earlier experiences. We thus distinguish between the rememberer and the hypnotic subject without appeal to identity. So Cohen is trying to save the argument from circularity here by appealing to something other than identity itself, in this case a particular kind of causation. So what Cohen is arguing for here is that what seems to make the one Gretchen real and the other only seeming to remember isn't the mere content of the memories, but the causal relationship they have with each other. Remember the chess game example, or the example of the double header. What makes the game the same is the relationship of the moves to one another. What makes the doubleheader the same isn't the score or the players on the field, but all the steps about how those players got to be in the places they were and how the score came to be what it was. The fake remember has the same memory content, but it was not caused in the right way. Cohen also points out that memory itself as the basis for personal identity is too mercurial. He says, the idea that real memory amounts to apparent memory plus identity is misleading anyways. I seem to remember as a small child knocking over the menorah so the candles fell into and spoiled a tureen of soup. And I did actually perform such a feat. So we have apparent memory and identity. But I do not actually remember. I was much too young when I did this to remember it now. I have simply been told the story so often I seem to remember. Here the suggestion that real memory is apparent memory that was caused in the appropriate way by past events fares better. Not my experience of pulling over the menorah, but hearing my parents talk about it later caused my memory-like impressions. Cohen is right about how often we are wrong about our own memories. There's a lot of modern science going into this. The more often you access a memory, the more likely you are to change it. In fact, every time you access a memory by remembering it, it is likely to change a little bit. I myself often have a memory of some scene in a movie or book, but can't remember whether the scene was a movie I saw visually or whether it was out of a book I read and then created the scene for myself from words on a page. Many of our core memories are accessed multiple times and have probably changed in many ways from what we think we actually remember, no matter how certain they feel. Weirab summarizes Cohen's point, saying, you analyze personal identity into memory and memory into apparent memory, which is caused in the right way. A person is a certain sort of causal process. Cohen agrees that this is right, and so Weirab asks how this can help explain Sam's case for the possibility of survival. She says, in ordinary memory, the causal chain from remembered event to the memory of it never leads us outside of the confines of a single body. Indeed, the normal process of which you speak surely involves storage of information somehow in the brain. How can the states of my brain when I die influence in the appropriate way the apparent memories of a heavenly person Sam takes to be me? Here Miller jumps back in, saying, surely this does provide me with the basis of further defense. Your challenge, Gretchen, was to explain the difference between two persons in heaven, one who actually remembers your experience, and so is you, and one who simply seems to remember it. But can I not just say that the one who is you is the one whose states were caused in the appropriate way? I do not mean the way that would be normal in the case of earthly memory, but in the case of a heavenly being who is you, God would have created her with the brain states, or whatever, she has just because you had the ones you had at death. So Wirab clarifies. So if God creates a heavenly person, designing her brain to duplicate the brain I have upon death, that person is me. If, on the other hand, a heavenly being should come to be with those very same memory-like states by accident, if there are accidents in heaven, it would not be me. Miller says exactly, but Wirab still has a problem. She says, the problem I see is this. If God could create one person in heaven and by designing her after me make her me, why could he not create two such bodies and cause this transfer of information into both of them? Would both of these heavenly persons be me? Oops, this is a problem. And Wirab continues to point out, if A is B and if C is B, then A must also be C. In other words, if Batman is Bruce Wayne, and if Bruce Wayne is the person who saw his parents murdered as a child, then Batman must also be the person who saw his parents murdered as a child. Wirab is referring back to numerical identity. Batman can be Bruce Wayne if and only if they are the same exact person. Anything that is true of one must be true of the other. This does not mean just having the same qualities, such as identical copies of a Kleenex box or a book, but rather being identical objects. So Wirab continues. If each of these heavenly persons is me, they must each be each other. But then they are not two, but one. But my assumption was that God creates two, not one. He could create them physically distinct, capable of independent movement, perhaps in widely separate heavenly locations, each with her own duties to perform, her own circle of heavenly friends and the like. So either God, by creating a heavenly person with a brain modeled after mine, does not really create somebody identical with me, but merely somebody similar to me, or God is somehow limited to making only one such being. I can see no reason why, if there were a God, he should be so limited. So I take the first option. He could create someone similar to me, but not someone who would be me. Either your analysis of memory is wrong, and such a being does not, after all, remember what I am doing or saying, or memory is not sufficient for personal identity. Your theory has gone wrong somewhere, for it leads to absurdity. So see the problem here. If God can take a person who is utterly destroyed and copy those memories in such a way as to create a person who is really Gretchen in heaven, there seems to be no reason why he cannot do this to 2, or 100 times. But 2 is not equal to 1, and there seems to be no reason to say that one of these copies is really Gretchen and the other is not. Cohen comes to Sam's defense again. He says, why can't Sam simply say that if God mates one such creature, she is you, while if he mates more, none of them is you? It is possible that he mates one, so it is possible that you survive. Sam always meant to allow it that it was possible that you won't survive. Wirab points out that this is a change in position. Now you are not claiming that memory alone is enough for personal identity. Now it is memory plus lack of competition, the absence of other rememberers, that is needed for personal identity. Cohen agrees that the position has shifted, but he is right that it doesn't matter. The new theory would need to be evaluated, and he asks if there is anything untenable about the position. Wirab says, let's look at this from the point of view of the heavenly person. She says to herself, oh, I must be Gretchen Wirab, for I remember doing what she did and saying what she said. But now that's a pretty tenuous conclusion, isn't it? She's really only entitled to say, oh, either I am Gretchen Wirab, or God has created more than one being like me, and none of us is. Identity has become something dependent upon things wholly extrinsic to her. Who she is now turns on not just her states of mind and the relationship to my states of mind, but on the existence or non-existence of other people. Is this really what you want to maintain? Or look at it from my point of view. God creates one of me in heaven. Surely I should be glad if convinced that this was to happen. Now he creates another, and I should despair again, for this means I won't survive at all. How can doubling a good deed make it worthless? Cohen asks if Wirab is saying that the position is contradictory, and Wirab says no, but that it seems odd in a way that shows there's something somewhere wrong with your theory. Here's a certain relationship I have with the heavenly person. There being such a person to whom I am related in this way is something that is of great importance to me, a source of comfort. It makes it appropriate for me to anticipate having her experiences since she is just me. She continues, why should my having that relation to another being destroy my relationship to this one? You say because then I will not be identical with either of them. But since you have provided a theory about what that identity consists in, we can look and see what it amounts to for me to be or not to be identical. If she is to remember my experience, I can rightly anticipate hers. But then it seems that doubling makes no difference. And yet it must, for one cannot be identical with two. So you add, in a purely ad hoc manner, that her memory of me isn't enough to make my anticipation of her experiences appropriate, if there are two rather than one so linked. Isn't it more reasonable to conclude, since my memory does not secure identity when there are two heavenly Gretchens, it also does not when there is only one? The phrase ad hoc means without justification or grounds. It was simply added to fulfill a particular purpose. Cohen admits that it's ad hoc, but not a contradiction. Whereof then says, an infinite pile of absurdities has the same weight as a contradiction, and absurdities can be generated without limit from your account. Suppose God created this heavenly person before I died, then he in effect kills me. If he has already created her, then you really are not talking to whom you think, but someone new, created by Gretchen Wehrob's strange death a moment ago. Or suppose he first creates one being in heaven who is me. He then creates another. Does the first cease to be me? If God can create such beings in heaven, surely he can do so in Albuquerque. And there is nothing on your theory to favor this body before you as Gretchen Wehrob's over the one belonging to this person created in Albuquerque. So I am to suppose that if God were to do this, I would suddenly cease to be. I am tempted to say I would cease to be Gretchen Wehrob, but that would be a confused way of putting it. There would be here, in my place, a new person with false memories of having been Gretchen Wehrob, who just died of competition. A strange death, if ever there was one. So notice how strange the position is that is now being put forward. God creates one Gretchen, and it is really her. Remember what is necessary for personal identity here. Gretchen must really be able to look forward to experiencing the life of that person. She, the Gretchen laying in bed, will experience that person's life in heaven. It will not merely be somebody identical to her experiencing it. But now suppose God created another. The ad hoc explanation is that they are now neither Gretchen. This means that the first Gretchen effectively died. But not only died, she was replaced by another Gretchen with the same memories. Only these memories are no longer connected in the right way for her to actually anticipate these experiences. An entirely new person would be having experiences. Somebody who did not exist before the second Gretchen was created. But how could God creating a second Gretchen possibly cause this to happen to her? As she pointed out, this new her could be created an entirely separate part of heaven. Suddenly she dies a death of competition, which she points out is a very strange death indeed. She finishes, surely this is nonsense. However carefully God should choose to duplicate me in heaven or in Albuquerque, I would not cease to be, or cease to be who I am. You may reply that God, being benevolent, would never create an extra Gretchen Wehrob, but I do not say that he would, but only that if he did, this would not, as your theory implies, mean that I cease to exist. Your theory gives the wrong answer in this possible circumstance, so it must be wrong. I think I have been given no motivation to abandon the most obvious and straightforward view on these matters. I am a live body, and when that body dies, my existence will be at an end. And that finishes this presentation on Perry's second night. There is a third night for those of you who are interested, but we must begin to push on to a different topic in the next module. Be sure to really spend some time thinking about these matters. There's probably some position about this topic that you would prefer to believe, but do not let that prevent you from struggling with the arguments on one side or the other. Only by really thinking about the argument will you gain a full appreciation for the theories. Until next time.